the newsagents.
Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 125. The noes to the left, 293.
A few oohs and ahs, because that was the Commons vote last night, which showed that a considerable number of Labour MPs had rebelled against Keir Starmer on the motion of whether there should be a ceasefire in Gaza, not the Labour leader's position. He wanted a humanitarian pause. The SNP called for a ceasefire, and dozens of Labour MPs voted with the SNP on that.
I guess one of the questions is whether Keir Starmer, who knew that there would be a substantial rebellion on this, had to whip that vote, had to, in other words, tell his MPs that they had to vote a certain way. In the end, he came down on the side of what he calls leadership. He wanted to make clear his position, not to call for a ceasefire, and if people in frontbench junior ministerial positions voted against it, they would lose their jobs.
So the headlines this morning are damaging rebellion. But has it really been that damaging? Welcome to the newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily. Oh, and it's a frog.
It's John, it's Emily, and a frog in the throat of Emily Maitlis that was uninvited. We've got to start with last night and the vote in the Commons and potentially the headlines. Catastrophic for Keir Starmer. Of course, catastrophic in the context of what had just happened to the government in the Supreme Court, which we're going to come on to later in the podcast. More than a quarter of his MPs voted against the Labour whip, i.e. Keir Starmer says, I want you to do this. More than 50 MPs said, I'm not going to do it. On the face of it, that looks a rebuff for Keir Starmer. But I'm not sure it was.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of spell out the mechanics of this, basically, Labour came up with their wording for a vote, and all the MPs did vote with Labour's motion, which was for a sort of humanitarian pause over Israel's actions in Gaza. But there was also this SNP motion. And I know that the sense from sort of some of Labour's top team was that the SNP were just trying to make trouble for Labour, that they were introducing this word ceasefire into their own motion as a way of trying to see if they could find splits between Keir Starmer and some of his party. So the SNP motion said, would you vote in favour of a ceasefire? And that was where the trouble started. Not that they didn't vote for Labour, but that they did vote for Labour and the SNP motion. And Starmer has made very clear that he doesn't think a ceasefire is workable because you're dealing with Hamas, a terrorist organisation, and that now is not the time to be telling Israel, the Israeli Defence Force, what they should and shouldn't be doing as their retaliation for those attacks on October the 7th. So this is where the splits start to emerge, except Starmer has clearly tried incredibly hard in this one to find the compromise, to find the wording, and to actually find the space for even those people who he had given shadow ministerial jobs to be able to go their own way if they had to. And some of them have now resigned.
So I'm sure in Keir Starmer's office and Keir Starmer himself, they will have thought long and hard about what is the appropriate response. What are the risks? What are the pitfalls? What's the upside? What's the downside? I think a year out from a likely date for a general election, Keir Starmer is thinking, I need to be a Prime Minister in waiting. I need to show the British people that I've got what it takes to be a Prime Minister. And one of the attacks, of course, from the Conservative Party about Keir Starmer is that he flip-flops. Oh, green energy, flip-flop.
Yeah.
You know, this policy, flip-flop. Nationalisation, flip-flop. But on this, he wanted to show it's a foreign policy matter. I am tough. I am not moving out of the shadow of Rishi Sunak. I am not moving out of the shadow of the US. And if it costs me, I will have shown principled leadership and I am prepared to take the risk. And I think that shows a degree of resolution and backbone which counters some of the Tory claims about Starmer.
Yeah.
That he's a flip-flopper.
Well, it was interesting. He put out a statement after the vote last night, and in the statement he said, I wanted to be clear about where I stood, your point on flip-flopping, where I will stand. Leadership is about doing the right thing. That's the least the public deserves and the least that leadership demands. So he's mentioned leaders or leadership 3 times in that. It may well be that this whole conversation does shift. It may well be, and we've started to see cracks in the Biden language and the Blinken language in the US. It might well be that they do get to something that is closer to calling for a ceasefire, or closer to asking Israel to hold off some of its military activity in Gaza. We haven't seen it yet, but that is, if you like, Starmer's next problem, right? It's where he moves towards once the US have signalled that they're moving towards that. What he doesn't want to do at the moment is open up any blue water on this with Rishi Sunak.
The other thing that struck me about last night's vote and speaking to people today is that often when there has been a rebellion, the best word to describe the day after is rancour. There's a lot of rancorous feeling on one side, on the other.
And we're all out to get it.
And we're, God, we want, give me more rancour.
Tell us,
yeah, exactly. And I don't think that has been there this time. I think that the Labour MPs who have voted for a ceasefire, voted for the SNP motion that the Speaker selected, probably have done so thinking, I have got to be true to my conscience, I've got to be true to the constituents that I represent in, wherever part of the country I happen to be an MP for, and that I have got to do what I think is right. I don't think that I get the impression that the Labour Party have said, if you do this, then we'll kill you. There seems to be a degree of tolerance, but Keir Starmer making clear, you can do this, but if you've got a front bench job, it's over.
Yeah. And that is what brings us to Jess Philips today. She was one of 8 shadow frontbenchers who voted for a ceasefire in the Commons last night. And she handed in her resignation pretty much as she did so. And this morning, she's giving us her first interview to tell us just what it felt like to go against the party, to go against a leader who you'd much rather be working with. Did you always know that you would be voting for the SNP motion for a ceasefire when it came to that vote last night?
No, I wouldn't say that is a fair characterisation. I called for a ceasefire. What seems like a lifetime ago, it was actually about 2 weeks ago, I think. I backed essentially the calls on the basis of the sort of humanitarian crisis as outlined by the Secretary-General of the United Nations. And so I hadn't sort of hidden that this was how I felt, and that I felt that military action, and still feel that military action is... I can't see at the moment how the current military action, I'm not against all military action, is going to lead to peace in the future or a solution at the moment in the Israel-Palestine crisis. But I hadn't hardened that I would absolutely vote for any motion that said anything to do with ceasefire until really, I suppose, ultimately the morning of the vote was the point at which I felt like that was going to be the outcome.
We know that Keir Starmer was working quite hard to find a form of words that would allow people like you to back his vote. In the end, 56 didn't, 8 frontbenchers went with the SNP. Did you have conversations with your leader before that vote or after you had voted? I mean, have you talked to Keir since?
Not since, but I spoke to him yesterday. So it hasn't even been 24 hours since I spoke to him. I just want to be clear as well. I think I can't speak for all of them, and I haven't checked the data, but I think all of the Labour MPs who voted with the SNP also did back the Labour motion. It's not that we didn't. But yeah, I spoke to him yesterday. Look, there's been conversations going on for weeks and weeks within the Labour Party. Really, it's funny that we end up in this situation where it makes out like people like me are some sort of like angry rebellion. But the actual reality is I saw the Parliamentary Labour Party over the last 4 weeks in difficulty, sometimes in pain, but never in anger or aggression. There is just, sometimes in politics, there is these disagreements, and I don't feel like it's fair, actually, particularly to suggest that this is some sort of ruction, or that me and Keir Starmer were giving each other the hairdryer treatment, or that certainly didn't happen. It's complicated and it's difficult, and largely we agree with each other. It's just a sort of sense of feeling specifically about really, really wanting to push the dial in some way towards a ceasefire, and lots of people will say, well, it's pointless, who cares what amendments are put forward in Parliament, like the people in the area are going to listen. But you could say that about almost anything in politics, couldn't you? You could say that about almost anything.
Jess.
And so
sorry,
I ended up where I ended up.
Yeah, I'm just interested in the way you characterise it, because so often in Parliament, when there is a big vote and you get the whips involved and you get the strong arm tactics, and then there are the rebels, and that is the language in which it's framed.
Yeah, that's not how it's been.
Yeah, well, that's what I want. So characterise it. Was Keir Starmer fed up with you, cross with you, or was it a perfectly kind of decent conversation?
He wasn't fed up. Well, he might have been fed up with you. You'd have to ask him that. But he didn't act fed up with me. He acted sympathetically. I have to say the Whip's office, the Labour Party Whip's office, deserve all the credit in the world, and they certainly won't be feeling that themselves this morning. I shouldn't imagine, because essentially on paper there is one test for how good they operate, but they have acted with kindness, understanding, not even cajoling, like conversations. It very much, I would say, the characterisation of the way that this has played out, certainly for me, and I can't speak for others within the Labour Party, is how it's played out in my constituency. The same situation has occurred. It hasn't been this sort of representation of angry people shouting at me and telling me I've got to vote a certain way. It has been my constituents having meaningful, often lengthy, upset, sad, sorrowful conversations with me.
But do you worry that the net effect of what you've done, even though it has been done in this kind of, let's use the language of the Labour Party, this fraternal camaraderie, that actually what you've done is undermined the authority of Keir Starmer?
Of course I worry about that. I hope that in speaking about it, I can try and change the sort of idea of constant political battles like Knights of the Long Knives being, grown up, and understanding collective responsibility, as I do, as he does, means that we ended up in a difficult position for both of us. I don't wish the Labour Party any harm. I don't just not wish the Labour Party any harm. I wish them as I am still. Some people are treating me a little bit like I've died. I have to say, I'm still alive. And I wish to be an asset to Keir Starmer, and I hope that is the way in which we go forward.
Was it made clear to you that if you did vote for the ceasefire, that you would have to resign your post? I mean, was that laid out, or did you offer that letter before the conversation even emerged?
Well, I mean, that's the obvious outcome. And nobody actually said to me, I'm going to have to sack you or anything like that. It was that this is the position of collective responsibility, and if you make this decision, then that is you making this decision. I'm not stupid. So I understood what I was doing, but nobody was like, you'll be sacked at noon sort of thing. It wasn't like that. And Jess, it's difficult and complicated, isn't it? That's the reality.
I mean, you have had to leave a job that, in your words, prioritised the chance to deliver a sea change in women's safety. Does that sit heavy on you now?
It sits incredibly heavy on me for a number of reasons, but there are other. In coming to the decision, I think that, the analysis that I took was that I have always managed, regardless of whatever job title I had, to be a huge voice and advocate in the space that I wish to work in and wish to change. And actually, the sort of capability of the hands of a combination of Keir Starmer, who does really care about this thing, and he's actually quite a knowledge on it because of his time working in the criminal justice system. One of the things Keir Starmer did say to me yesterday was, I need people like you to help me deliver the missions that we have come up with together, you and I, Jess. And I said, then you have me.
That sounds like you'll be back, doesn't it?
I will continue forever to do this work. I don't need a job title to do it. You know, there's no animosity. The work carries on. It started a long time before I'd ever met Keir Starmer. But do you know what is bad leadership? Bad leadership is that if you remove one person from a situation, the cause that they cared about dies. If I thought that that's what I was leaving behind, then I wouldn't have done a very good job in the first place.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether, as well, you might think, Jess, that was it worth it in the sense that this is a motion, you're not in government, this is the opposition voting, it doesn't change anything. In Jerusalem or the West Bank or Gaza, is anyone going to be saying, oh, there were plus more than 50 Labour rebels in the House of Commons in Westminster last night?
No, of course they're not. I think that had the whole House voted for it, I find it very unlikely that the sort of brutal regime of Hamas or that Benjamin Netanyahu was going to be listening to anything that I say. But if I only ever stood up for things in politics that I was 100% going to get, well, I would have probably spent one day in Parliament last year. I spend my entire life like hoping for things that are, I want to end domestic abuse. Well, good luck. I won't live to see that. That literally won't happen. But I have to use my voice to try and, wherever possible, move a dial. And look, I think this dial will move. I think that it won't be too long before the US and the UK feel that the military action is achieving nothing.
Yeah.
And so, look, you know, people can think it's a gesture, but actually it comes from a place with my constituents as well, that they have shown me such thoughtful love and kindness over the last 4 weeks, genuine solidarity and kindness and thoughtfulness, that they deserved for me to represent them and to thank them for that.
Jess, you were joined by 7 other frontbenchers in last night's vote. Would you have liked to see shadow cabinet ministers there with you?
To be perfectly honest, I think that everybody who made their decision from the Labour Party made it with heavy hearts and pain and concern for all sorts of things, both in the UK and abroad. One of the hardest decisions about doing this is the thought that I get pitted against some of my colleagues who made a different decision. And I'm just not interested in that being the conversation at all. I am no hero. I don't want people to, or the alternative, say that they did the right thing and I didn't do the right thing. We just disagreed on very, very small margins of difficult things. And we have different constituencies and have had different experiences in how we get there. I just think that everybody who made their decision yesterday didn't make it lightly.
Jess Philips, thanks very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
I know what you're going to say.
What?
That's what grown-up politics sounds like, isn't it?
Well, I was going to say something slightly different. Yes, but the point I was going to make was I felt in that interview you could hear the pain that she's gone through to reach the judgment that she's made. Not that she feels she's made the wrong judgment. She clearly feels she's made the right judgment. But how painful it has been for her and how painful it has been for everyone. And it's kind of, the tone was so much more in sorrow than in anger. Yeah. And so much of this debate has been marked by the anger and not the sorrow.
That's what I mean.
And that was the bit that was grown up, which I loved to hear. And it was reflective and it was a genuine... We talk on this podcast quite often about trying to pull the curtain back to show, and I thought you saw there the mental calculations, the torment that she's been through trying to get to the decision that she felt she had to make, and saying she only made it yesterday morning.
I think it's a really important point, that, because we were talking to Labour over the last sort of 24, 48 hours, and people think these things are set in stone, but the SNP motion came slightly blindsided Labour, I think, and they weren't expecting that. Then Labour had to rearrange the wording of what they were saying, so it didn't quite say ceasefire, but it got as close to saying ceasefire as it could, but within the sense of a humanitarian pause. And so suddenly people are being rushed in to vote on something, which actually they haven't been sitting on for weeks and weeks, not in the exact wording. They've had to make those decisions actually at the very last minute, depending on what is in front of them at that point.
One of the questions I asked her was about, the way that this gets characterised when there is a big vote and you've got the division bell ringing and the whips are out and they're pulling your arm behind your back and saying, if you do this, then we will do that to you, we'll destroy you, la, 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 la. You just feel that none of that happened last night. And I think that it says something about Starmer's leadership as well, that he would have actively instructed the Whip's office, no strong arm tactics, go easy, people have got to come to their own judgment. And so, has it helped Keir Starmer to have a rebellion where more than a quarter of your MPs vote against what you ask them to do? No, of course it's not helpful. But is it catastrophic? No, it's not catastrophic either.
It's also probably not representative, not truly, of what will happen when he does face a real rebellion as putative leader.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing as well. This is a very deeply felt, and as Jess Philips herself would say, intellectualised debate about something that you would like to see happen in a part of the world that you actually can't control. If it's about housing, if it's about disability allowance, if it's about the sort of two-child benefit policy, I think you wouldn't actually see quite such a calm demeanour from the party as a whole.
And there will be one huge difference. If Keir Starmer is Prime Minister Starmer and there is a vote in the Commons on something that has been in the Labour Party manifesto and you get a bunch of rebels who say, I'm not going to vote for that, then, you bet there's going to be strong-arm tactics and you bet he's going to try and force people into line. But this is something that was kind of out of the blue. It is a conscience thing a lot of people feel very powerfully about. And he has kind of responded in that way, I think.
A little bit later, after that excoriating Supreme Court judgment that the Rwanda scheme was unlawful, we'll be asking whether the Conservatives can just whip the whole thing into shape with a new treaty with Rwanda and get it through anyway.
So on the podcast yesterday, I said it was the most expensive press release in history. It's cost £140 million so far in money to Rwanda, and not a person has gone there. The government is still hoping that by next spring, those flights will be taking off. I'm prepared to bet quite a bit of money that they won't be, because what the government has now done is come up with a plan B where it says we're going to introduce emergency legislation, which when the Supreme Court says Rwanda is not a safe place to go, we're going to say Rwanda is a safe place to go, as if it's just a question of semantics rather than objective reality of what the situation is in Rwanda. And you just think, is this really going to fly?
So yesterday we explained the difference between a treaty that had sort of the underpinning of law and a memorandum of understanding, which is what the government were sort of going with, a wing and a prayer. Today, you've suddenly heard senior members of the government, including the new Home Secretary, saying, oh, don't worry, we'll get it turned into a treaty. It'll be done within a matter of days. They say that they've carried on simultaneously trying to get this treaty through. So I was talking to a few sort of legal brains on this and saying, well, it sounds as if they can just turn the memorandum into a treaty and that can be done in a matter of days. And they basically laughed in my face. And they said, look, the whole point of the Supreme Court judgment relied on this question of non-refoulement principle, which is whether Rwanda would send people back to their country of origin without having actually looked at their cases properly. And they said it doesn't matter what you call it. It doesn't matter if you call it a piece of paper or a memorandum or a treaty. You can't just call something a treaty and expect Rwanda to fundamentally change their position on what they would do. And I was directed towards one specific paragraph 104 in this Supreme Court ruling. And this is the paragraph that says Rwanda to paraphrase, doesn't have the legal infrastructure. They do not have enough judges. They do not have enough capacity to check the asylum cases one by one. They do not have enough of a legal structure, a backbone at the moment, to be able to cope with everything that this treaty would imply. And so actually the idea that they just suddenly sort of whisk it through under a different name is kind of pie in the sky, and quite possibly nothing to do with policy, everything to do with internal Conservative Party politics, which is giving Rishi something to say at 5 o'clock in the afternoon after that devastating summary that happened at 10 o'clock yesterday.
Well, we've had the letter from Suella Braverman the day before talking about Rishi Sunak's magical thinking, that there is no plan B. And it's like, you've just been knocked over by a knockout punch and you get up and say, I'm ready to fight again. I'm fine. No, that didn't even hurt at all. I have got a plan B and we're ready to go. And I demand a rematch immediately so that I can fight this again. Yeah. And you just think, this is all nuts. Even if, okay, let's say I'm totally wrong. Let's say that every court case and your lawyers don't know what they're talking about and the plane takes off in April to Rwanda. What are we going to have at the very most before the next general election? 100, 200 people going to Rwanda? Even in the best possible scenario for the government.
Yeah, but I don't think you're going to have any. I mean,
no, I don't think you are.
That's the point, fundamentally, that if the Supreme Court believe that Rwanda doesn't understand the principle of non-refoulement, sending people back, if there's evidence of human rights violations, then there is no way that the Supreme Court suddenly flip this decision round. And if they're looking at primary legislation, it has to go through the Lords. And we know that the law lords were the ones who, a year ago in October 2022, were already telling the government this would be unlawful. So you wonder whether it is about realistic expectations or it's just about trying to avoid a bust-up.
You're refusing to go with my hypothetical that the government...
boring, aren't I?
I know. Yeah. My hypothetical is, let's say the government wins it hands down. Yeah. It will still only be the most totemic thing that happens if 100 people fly to Rwanda. That is not dealing with the thousands of people who are crossing the channel in small boats. It might have a slight, negative effect and deterrent effect, perhaps a bit. But it's become so important for Rishi Sunak's leadership that this policy that was nothing to do with him, but he has picked up. It was before he was Prime Minister that people were talking about Rwanda. But it's become a matter of party management. And everyone's saying, this is his last chance. He's got to get this through. Otherwise, the right are going to absolutely rise up against him. And so something that is not going to deal with the problem has assumed this gigantic importance for what was a bit of a whiz-o-wheeze to get right-wing papers on board when you were dealing with the small boats crisis.
It's a bit like standing there and saying, something must be done.
Yeah.
Right? You can say something must be done as many times as you want. It doesn't necessarily mean you are going to get this off the ground.
And something must be done does not translate into good legislation, ever.
This is a notoriously conservative Supreme Court with something that was passed on to me. It was not a liberal court. And this will have a very long-term impact because the way that this is phrased, the kind of language they've used, they have made it very difficult for the government, both short-term and medium-term, to do anything. It is very, very impactful from the language that they're using. So it kind of stretches, if you like, past whatever the government thinks its next move is going to be.
Well, let's speak now to Dominic Grieve. He was the Attorney General in the Conservative government, but then fell foul of Boris Johnson and Brexit and is now no longer Attorney General and no longer an MP, but has great expertise in these matters. Dominic Grieve, is Plan B going to work?
I have my doubts that it will work. We have to understand that the judgment of the Supreme Court wasn't some esoteric point of law. It was a finding of fact that individuals sent to Rwanda were at risk of being sent back to their countries of origin where they might be mistreated. And that was based on a factual analysis of the circumstances prevailing in Rwanda, which in fact the government didn't itself really seek to challenge. What the government argued was that because it had a memorandum of understanding with the Rwandan government, that would be sufficient to overcome those real problems that the government acknowledged existed. Now, the government says it's now going to replace the Memorandum of Understanding with a treaty. And it's possible, I suppose, that by doing that, that might be sufficient to meet the factual tests. But what is most unusual is that what the government has then said is that it's simply going to decide for itself that the facts are then sufficient to justify sending people to Rwanda, even without allowing the courts to consider the matter any further. And to do that, they're going to have to override domestic legislation and potentially our international treaty obligations to achieve that. Now, that is a pretty extraordinary decision to make. And the first question is, I think it will be very controversial in the House of Commons, and I also think it might not get through the House of Lords because it is such an extraordinary way for the government to proceed. Then there's the question about whether any legal challenge can be mounted to it in this country if it goes through. And without looking at the legislation and seeing it, and without seeing exactly what it says or doesn't say, it's hard to know whether that might happen. But what is certainly the case is that as long as we are signatories of the convention, then it will be possible for somebody to go to Strasbourg and say to the International Court, and to say in those circumstances, my rights are being violated.
Isn't the government then going to say, we're going to burn everything down, we'll just withdraw from our obligations to that court, we'll leave the European Convention on Human Rights, all the rest of it?
Do they really mean that? The consequences that flow from it are pretty significant. It's probably the end of our trade and cooperation agreement with the European Union, which seems to have at least helped stabilise our economy after the damage that's been done to it through Brexit. We would have to come out of Horizon. We wouldn't be able to data share. We would have the United States government probably breathing down the back of our neck over Northern Ireland because it would be a breach of the Good Friday Agreement. These are significant political costs. Now, the cynic in me says that actually the government has no intention of coming to that crunch. Yeah. What it wants desperately is a plane flight to Rwanda, and of course future challenges, particularly in the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, might well not materialise until after the next election. So they may feel that they can push that down the road. But it is a very strange way of operating at a governmental level, because it is very bad governance to behave in this fashion.
What the Home Secretary made clear this morning was that he thinks they don't need to leave the ECHR or even talk about that anymore, that they just have to modify it. And it is possible, isn't it, to modify some of the laws within the ECHR. I think Ken Clarke did it when he was Lord Chancellor. So I guess, they can work around the ECHR whilst we remain inside it, can't they?
Well, I'm not quite sure that you could say it that way. It is true that getting modifications to the way the ECHR works is possible. I did it with Ken Clarke in 2011. They were quite subtle shifts of interpretation, but I think that they've actually borne fruit in a way that pleased everybody, including in this country. But if you're going to do that, you tend to need to be in a position of saying that you're supportive, not in a position where there's an underlying message, which is, if not, I am going bombastic. To be burning every bridge available. Yeah. I think that then makes our diplomatic heft much more limited. It's right to say that if the government were to get its treaty right with Rwanda, I can see a possibility that actually our own Supreme Court would say it's compatible with both its interpretation of the convention and also our international obligations under the refugee conventions. But that, of course, might take a bit of time. And it's the impression one has of the government is that because it wants to short-circuit this, it's prepared to resort to methods which I think are at risk of being damaging to its overall position and potentially counterproductive.
So when we heard Lee Anderson say yesterday, the deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, sod the laws, put the planes in the sky anyway, that is actually becoming kind of de facto government policy now. Is that what you're hearing?
Well, it's not quite what the government's saying, because it was squashed pretty quickly by other ministers. Indeed, if we were to attempt to do that, then actually you could end up having a minister being sent to prison for contempt of court. So I think Mr. Anderson just simply doesn't understand what the rule of law in a country actually is. Clearly, Parliament can be used to override the existing law, and it can potentially be used to override our existing international obligations. But it's a very risky business, and it is likely to encounter quite considerable obstacles before it can be carried out. And when it has been carried out, I think it may be highly questionable that it brings the benefits that the government thinks it will.
Dominic, we've spoken to you mainly about the law and how to apply it. Can we just talk politics for a second? What's going on here?
What's going on is that the government, having made a promise about trying to solve the issue of illegal immigration by people coming seeking asylum by crossing the channel on boats, and having made a rather rash promise that there was an easy solution to it, is finding itself, as it nears a general election, increasingly having to face the fact that it has taken a course of action which in fact is unworkable. And they're desperately trying to salvage something from it. And of course, the reason for those mistakes lies with the ministers who took it at the time and those who have, in my view, rather crazily maintained it, such as Suella Braverman, thereafter. But it classically illustrates what happens when you start engaging in displacement activity to give the impression you're doing something when you're not necessarily tackling the fundamental problems that are causing it. And of course, since Brexit, we have added problems because our cooperation with our European neighbours to try and tackle this, which is indispensable to dealing with this problem, is much more difficult.
Dominic Grieve, thanks so much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure.
Before we go, David Williams in Ringwood has written to us. Not only written to us, Maitlis, we have got Boy Scouts and Girls Guide badges.
Yay! Show me.
They are proper Velcro fastened badges that are sewn and stitched, which say achievement in potty mouth. Achievement in potty mouth. Because he thinks we swear quite a lot.
What a disappointing episode this will be for Dave in Ringwood.
I know,
right?
because we haven't
Nothing.
sworn once.
Not even the tiniest, not even a batshit.
Not even a bloody.
No, nothing.
Nothing at all. And he goes, I listen to the podcast most days and love it. The rapport between the three of you and the shared humour really makes it work. Your freedom to express yourselves makes it so much more accessible. I couldn't resist sending these iron-on merit badges. Long may you F and Jeff. All the best, David Williams, Ringwood.
Isn't it depressing when freedom of expression just comes down to sort of telling people to fuck off?
You've ruined it.
I know.
You
Sorry.
just...
Go back. Undo it.
Okay.
Dave, we love our card.
Thank you.
We're getting the iron out now.
Okay.
We're not here tomorrow, but Keir Starmer will be. And
Yeah.
Lewis. From Scotland.
Don't miss it. Bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.